In this critical Let's Play, I will be arguing for Bogo's theory on procedural rhetoric by giving examples from the game Firewatch that shows this theory in action. To begin, I'll give a brief overview of the game Firewatch. Firewatch is a first-person walking simulator adventure game developed by Campo Santo and published by Panic for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation in 2016, and then subsequently for the Nintendo Switch in 2018. In Firewatch, the player takes control of Henry, who has just recently taken up a summer job as a fire lookout in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. Henry's wife Julia was diagnosed with early onset dementia in 1985 after an episode at her work leading to Julia and Henry's relationship becoming strained, for Henry to pick up drinking more, and for Julia to move back home to Australia for her parents to take care of her. Trying to find a way to escape his life and to cope with the loss of his loved one, Henry leaves Colorado in the spring of 1989 to take up a job as a fire lookout. Here is where he meets Delilah, his supervising fire lookout, boss, and new friend, who has only ever heard in conversation over the radio and never seen in person. Delilah becomes someone that keeps Henry company during his time of grief and isolation from the world. Eventually, Henry and Delilah uncover a seemingly government-like project that is tracking Henry and Delilah's behavior and recording their conversations. Together, they investigate this mystery, with Delilah always being a radio call away to help Henry. Henry then discovers that the person who has been tracking and watching him is none other than a man named Ned Goodwin. According to Delilah, Ned was the previous fire lookout who occupied Henry's lookout tower before him with his son Brian. Brian was a lot closer to Delilah than Ned was, often talking to her over the radio in the same way Henry did. According to Delilah, Ned and his son just up and left one day without warning, never to be seen again, until Henry stumbles upon Ned while walking back to his tower one night. It is revealed that the Goodwins had disappeared after Brian died in a climbing accident in the cave near Henry's lookout, causing Ned to become a hermit in the woods, grieving over the loss of his son. Overall, Firewatch engages its players with a story about grief, isolation, escapism, and responsibility. But before I dive into Firewatch and how it uses procedural rhetoric, I'll discuss what actually is procedural rhetoric. In Bogo's paper, he presents his theory about the rhetoric of games, dubbing it procedural rhetoric. Bogos explains that games are artifacts that can communicate real-world issues, ideas, or messages through their mechanics. He argues that gaming is a cultural activity that can develop values due to things like message boards and online gaming communities. He continues saying games make claims about the world that others can evaluate, understand, and deliberate, but are often discredited for this due to their play-like nature. Bogos thinks that play should not be a leisure activity, but should instead be looked at as a free space of movement within a more rigid structure, or as he dubs, a possibility space. This possibility space is the system of rules in the game world you play that allows players to explore it and uncover its meaning for themselves by observing what the game does or does not allow in this possibility space. Basically, the possibility space is the environment that you play in the game. It's the rules, it's the mechanics, it's everything that you do in the game or explore. So the Bogos, procedural rhetoric is made of two parts. The first are procedures, which are constraints on how to do things that create a possibility space and create meaning through its interaction with algorithms in the computer. This literally is just that computer programs or rules or any sort of environmental challenge or blockade that's presented to the player in a game. Things the players can see and can't see. The next is rhetoric, which is simply put, meaning through persuasion. Bogos introduces an idea called artistic rhetoric, which is simply something that doesn't seek to persuade or to meet some ends, but it looks to create a desired possibility space, which he relates to gaming's procedural rhetoric. And to simply put, Bogart's procedural rhetoric is using processes or game mechanics to persuade. Games use this to explain and expose ideology. They can use it to get players to experience certain things that they've never experienced before, to give meaning, to bring up certain hot topics that they want players to understand better, or maybe for them to make their own meaning out of art, just simply show feelings. But they do this by using procedures, such as mechanics, video game mechanics, or programs, or the environment around them. So how does Firewatch use procedural rhetoric through its mechanics? The first mechanic I'd like to look at is the basic way of navigation the game offers, a simple map and compass. This is how our main character Henry and the player navigate the wide open wilderness of the Shoshone Forest. While most video games require some form of navigation due to the player needing to navigate their environments to play, Firewatch's navigation system is very limited and is challenging to use. There's no mini-map, and if it is provided, the landmarks are all hand-drawn by Henry and are often in general areas, denoted by a large circle of sorts, pointing to the general area of where Henry needs to go. There's no specific XY locations with a track, and there's no tracker, like in many other games, that shows you exactly where you need to go. The game is making people think like a fire lookout, only giving you the tools they would have and to learn to navigate the world like they would. This leads many players to get lost, including myself, while traveling between certain locations in game. Much like Henry is lost at his point in life. This mechanic is communicating Henry's feeling of being lost, not knowing if he should be out here in the woods running away from his problems, or if he should be going back home and confronting them. The next mechanic I'll be analyzing is the text-based adventure-like prologue in the beginning of the game. In this section, the player is presented with several options on how to interact with Julie while her and Henry's relationship begins. Several of these include posing for a picture that she's painting of you in her book, or choosing what kind of dog you and her have, including the name of the dog. The book example comes up later in the prologue when Henry is seen sitting by a fire reading the book, and the picture that's drawn there is the same pose that the player will select earlier in the prologue. With the dog example, the dog appears later in the prologue, as well as a dialogue option to talk to with Delilah later in the game. I feel like this mechanic really communicates how our actions can affect our lives, and that your choices matter in life, and that they overall affect the story even if they're small things like naming a dog. Another interesting point with this mechanic is when continuing the events of the dialogue, the buttons you press to continue the dialogue are the same ones as you make choices with. These buttons look exactly the same, function the same, but when you make choices and when you continue the dialogue, they're all in the first person, which gives a sense that Henry is internalizing these decisions, and it makes me think that he thinks that his decisions are the reasons for Julia's condition and the situation that he's in.
And you'll have to...
The third mechanic I'd like to discuss is the radio and Delilah. This is one mechanic that's very essential to driving forward the plot of the game, as Delilah is the one who prompts Henry to explore certain areas and confronts him and comforts him throughout the game. She gives you directions on where to go if you're lost, gives you tips about good spots in the woods to check out, and gives you some solid advice to Henry on how to deal with his problems. The radio makes you feel less alone in the game. She gives you direction on where to go if you're lost, gives you tips about good spots in the woods to check out, and gives you some solid advice on Henry on how to deal with his problems.
And figure it out down there.
The radio makes you feel less alone in the game, where you don't even have a face-to-face conversation with any other character. It allows Henry and the player to express themselves and to make choices that affect the overall story, much like the prologue discussed earlier. I think Delilah and the radio communicate that the best course of action when in a situation like Henry's is to never isolate.
Okay. So
Delilah is there with Henry through the radio all the way to the end, which helps Henry figure out what he should do with Julia, which ultimately leads him to decide to go back and see her at the end of the game. Finally, I'd like to look at the props and the environment in Firewatch as the last mechanic. Throughout the game, Henry will find many objects which the player can pick up and observe. These objects can communicate a wide range of ideas, such as where Henry picks up the bottle of whiskey from the girls' camp. Instead of pressing E to dispose of it like the other beer cans surrounding it, instead the game prompts you to save it for later. This beer bottle, or the whiskey bottle, then appears several times on Henry's desk throughout the game. I feel like this is trying to convey a struggle with alcohol Henry may have due to Henry using the bar as a means of escape when he still lived with Julia at the time. Alcoholism occurs often in this game. Even it seems that Delilah struggles with it too. Another way that these environmental props are used is to foreshadow certain things that happen later in the game. For example, Henry finds a backpack full of climbing equipment that belonged to Brian Goodwin near a steep drop that Henry then climbs down only for his rope to break, leaving him to fall. But later in the game, it's revealed that Brian died in the exact same way as Henry did, falling due to a broken rope in a cave. But except with Henry, it was in a cave and he didn't die. While I am in support of procedural rhetoric as a theory, I do have some critiques with it. The first being that I believe it's more of a slippery slope, because where do we draw the line? How do we separate meaning from playability? As some features in games are implemented mainly to just make the game more playable, make it more entertaining, or just to make the game work in general. Some things exist in games simply to make them work, and that don't have any deeper meaning. For example, talking to someone and determine what their meaning is way easier than a complex piece of software. Another critique I have is, how do we differentiate from casual and non-rhetorical play? If someone is playing a game like Call of Duty, where there is no meaning to be ventured for the most part, how do we differentiate that from play that is like Firewatch, where you're getting a meaningful story, or games like Gone Home, or What It Means to Edith Finch, was a deep, passionate story where there's a greater meaning to be drawn? And my last critique is, not every play can get meaning because people just play differently. The way people interact with certain designs and certain possibility spaces can be completely different depending on who you ask, what game they're playing, what mood they're in, what kind of person they are, or even any other of those main factors. But overall, I believe that Firewatch is a great example of procedural rhetoric, and I believe that more people should be playing games more rhetorically than passively playing them when they can. That is all I have. Thank you.